If you've been following energy prices at all lately, you know that something feels off. Not just volatile in the way of the usual business cycle, it feels different in a more chaotic sense. Prices are spiking, then they fall, then they spike again, and the explanations are alternating. Geopolitics this time, a drought the next, supply chain the time after that, and then all of these things all over again. A group of political economists have now started calling this situation the Great Volatility. And I think that framing is spot on, because it names something that our existing economic vocabulary is struggling to describe. So in this video, I want to delve into what they mean by that. And to do that, I need to introduce you to a concept called Climateflation. But first, let's take a step back. To understand where we are right now, it helps to know where economists thought we had arrived. Because from roughly the mid-1980s to the early 2000s, the global economy went through a period that economic historians call the Great Moderation. Inflation was low and stable, growth was steady, supply chains hummed along, central banks had seemingly cracked the code. Now, to be clear, that stability was not equally distributed. The 1990s saw wars in the Balkans, post-Soviet conflicts, civil wars across sub-Saharan Africa. The Great Moderation was a view from a particular vantage point. But within mainstream economic governance circles, particularly in the global north, the belief was that the worst of the volatility was behind us. That belief is now very difficult to sustain. The 2008 financial crisis dented it, COVID shattered it, Russia's invasion of Ukraine confirmed it, and the subsequent years of geopolitical turbulence with their trade conflicts, resurgent oil price shocks and disrupted supply chains have made it essentially impossible to argue that we are anywhere near a return to moderation. Instead, we are in something new. And what two political economists, James Jackson and Ryan Katz-Rosene, have recently argued in the journal Globalizations, is that we need a new framework to understand it. That framework is climateflation. The core insight seems simple. Climate change, meaning its causes, its physical effects, and the global effort to fix it are all simultaneously driving up prices and making them harder to predict. That is climateflation. It isn't a single thing, but it's a confluence of three separate but interrelated forces. Jackson and Katz-Rosene call these forces Fossilflation, Carbonflation, and Greenflation. Now let's look at them individually, because I think they're quite illuminating and because they're also quite different from each other. We're starting with fossilflation. Fossilflation is the cost of being locked into a system built on fossil fuels. By 2023, fossil fuels still accounted for roughly 76% of global primary energy consumption. That is a mind-boggling degree of dependency. And what it means in practice is that any disruption to the supply of oil, gas, or coal, for instance in the shape of a geopolitical crisis, a military conflict, a sanctions regime, a speculative run, all of these send price shocks rippling through nearly everything, because nearly everything depends on energy to be made and moved. We have seen this play out a few times in recent years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine resulted in hundreds of billions of euros in additional fuel costs across Europe within 14 months. And the paper was written in the context of resurgent oil prices from further geopolitical disruptions since then. And that is a reminder that this kind of shock is not a one-off event, but a recurring feature of a system built on fossil fuel dependency. And here's the thing about fossilflation, and the paper is careful to acknowledge this. It doesn't only go in one direction. Fossil fuel prices have in times been deflationary. They collapsed briefly into negative territory during COVID when demand evaporated. So this is not just a story of everything getting more expensive linearly. This is about volatility in a system that is inherently unstable and whose price signals are tied to geopolitical events that no central bank can predict or control. And that instability is the problem in itself. The second force is carbonflation. And this is where the physical reality of what is happening to our planet enters the frame. For most of human civilization's settled history, atmospheric CO2 levels hovered around 275 parts per million. By 2025, we had reached 430 parts per million. Earth's average temperature has already risen by approximately 1.3 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. And the changes that come with that, so weather patterns, hydrological cycles, the frequency and intensity of extreme events, they show up in the prices. When droughts reduce crop yields, food prices rise. When extreme heat makes outdoor labor conditions increasingly unworkable, production costs go up. When rising sea levels and more intense storms erode coastlines and damage infrastructure, repair and insurance costs climb. When flood and fire disrupts a shipping route or a supply chain node, goods become temporarily scarce and more expensive. The insurance example is actually really striking. We're not just talking about home insurance, although that is rising fast too. Climate change-induced insurance premium increases are now being linked in US Federal Reserve research to higher rates of mortgage delinquency and credit card delinquency. One study described their findings as revealing a channel through which climate change can threaten households' financial health and potentially impact the stability of the financial system. Multiple US states saw the insurance industry post losses in 2023, even as premiums rose sharply. The Senate Budget Committee concluded that climate change was actively destabilizing insurance markets. This is not a future risk, that is happening right now. And carbonflation, like fossilflation, is characterized by spasmodic shocks rather than steady linear increases. Extreme weather events create temporary supply disruptions which drive sudden price spikes, which then ease again, only for the next event to repeat the cycle. This is the pattern we should expect to get worse, given that the world is currently on track for somewhere between 2.7 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. The third force is the most counterintuitive one, and it is easily misread. Greenflation refers to the inflationary pressures generated by the green transition itself. But let's be clear about what this does and doesn't mean, because this argument has been weaponized by people who want to use it as a reason to not transition. That is not what the research is saying. Jackson and Katz-Rosene are quite outspoken about this. The costs of not transitioning are higher than the costs of transitioning. This is the near consensus view of economists working in this space all over the world. But it is still worth scrutinizing the short to medium term costs. Transitioning a global energy system requires enormous upfront investment. It requires raw materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth minerals, whose prices have been quite volatile, and that's partly due to geopolitical concentration of supply and partly due to surging demand. China's dominance in processing many of these minerals creates a specific problem. If China chose to restrict supply, it could unilaterally export inflationary pressure to the rest of the world. There are also socio-political dynamics at play that greenflation can trigger. Carbon pricing, green levies, mandated appliance upgrades, all of these can land unevenly and fall harder on the lower income households and generate the kind of resentment that populist movements exploit. The Yellow Vest movement in France was, in part, a response to exactly this, and in some corners opposition to climate policy has been absorbed into much broader conspiracy theories about elite control and economic manipulation. Of course, this doesn't mean that the transition shouldn't happen. It means it has to be designed well and with real attention to distribution and justice. Greenflation is real, but it is also in theory the most manageable of the three forces because it is the product of political choices, not physical inevitability. So let's see what this all adds up to. And here's where I think the Climateflation framework becomes useful. Taken together, fossilflation, carbonflation, and greenflation don't just add up to higher prices. They interact with each other and with other sources of instability like geopolitical conflict, trade wars, supply chain fragility, populist politics in ways that can amplify each other. The paper draws on a concept from complexity research called the polycrisis, the idea that simultaneous crises in different domains produce feedback effects that make each individual crisis worse. Climateflation in this reading is not just one more stressor, it is a critical force that runs through and magnifies the others. And that is why Jackson and Katz-Rosene think the term Great Volatility is the right one for this era. Not just a return to the Great Inflation of the 1970s, not the steady calm of the Great Moderation, but a new period characterized by spasmodic interacting price shocks, driven by forces that monetary policy alone cannot address. Raising interest rates doesn't stop a drought, it doesn't neutralize a geopolitical blockade of an energy choke point. It doesn't remove the physical consequence of decades of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. So, is there a way through all of this? Well, let's end the video on something that is neither falsely optimistic nor unnecessarily bleak, because I think both fail to match what the actual situation is. The argument that climateflation makes is not that prices will simply rise forever. It is a bit more nuanced than that. Fossilflation, Carbonflation and Greenflation can each, under different conditions, also exert disinflationary pressure. Renewables are getting dramatically cheaper. A fully green energy grid would be less exposed to the kind of geopolitical shocks that make fossilflation so dangerous. Climate adaptation done well can reduce the economic damage from extreme events. And when we look at the relationship between the three, reducing fossil fuel dependency through the green transition is the only path that simultaneously addresses fossilflation and carbonflation. A greener energy system is a less geopolitically exposed one, and the economic damage from extreme weather events diminishes as emissions fall. Investing in transition is expensive now, but it is the mechanism by which we reduce exposure to the volatility that is already here and getting worse. So the question is whether the transition happens fast enough and justly enough to matter. And here's where I land on this. Climateflation is not a catchy economic buzzword. It is an attempt to name something that is changing the conditions under which the global economy operates, and it insists that we understand inflation and instability through the lens of climate change, rather than alongside it as a separate concern. The Great Moderation is sadly over. The Great Volatility is, by most indications, already underway, and the tools we have for managing it will need to be as broad as possible to address the forces driving it. I've linked the paper this is based on in the description. It's open access and worth reading if you want to go deeper. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Does the climateflation framing match what you're seeing in your own context? And which of these three forces feels most present to you right now? And if you want to support this channel, you can buy me a coffee. The link is in the description too. Thank you for joining me, and see you again soon.